2026. This is the first event in this academic season. That is abundant with events. It is our pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Nader Qadem, who will deliver a presentation entitled The Banyan Chronicle, A History of the Gulf Through an Indian Trading Community. Personally, and as a researcher in the center and head of the unit, I have the pleasure of having Dr. Nader. He is a friend that I've met over 20 years ago, and I remember that in 2003 or 2004, I heard his name for the first time reading a study about Edward Said in Al Bahrain Cultural Journal. And it was the time of the death of Edward Said, or a little after that. He died in September 2003. And it was a distinguished and good study about the politicized dealing of Edward Said. And then we became friends, and we have in common the fact that we both come from the field of literature and philology and language. And then we went through history and nationalism. And from his journey, from literature and into history, specifically the history of the Gulf, the region where he comes from, and the region of this institution, the Arab Center for Research. He produced a number of work sheets and papers that achieved for him a great exposure, and this reveals these communities' thirst for more knowledge about its history. And this lies at the essence, at the heart of the mission and the message of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies Unit, about international relations, politics, and opening the issue of history as people and as communities. As I said, Dr. Nader will present a lecture about this historical interest that he occupied himself with in the last years. He will talk about the Banyan group, which is an Indian group that resided in the Gulf and worked in the Gulf centuries ago, or for centuries. And he has published a book from Tata to Bahrain about the Banyan Chronicle in Bahrain. I believe his lecture today is an elaboration and a continuity of his interest in this issue. Before I give him the floor, I will introduce him. He is an author, academic, and intellectual from Bahrain. He has a PhD in Arab literature from the Institute of Literature, and he worked as a professor at the University of Bahrain from 2010 until 2022, and he has the prize of the distinguished researcher for his book المقامات والتلقي, and the second in his studies in social studies for his book and the representations of the others, the image of black people in the Arab mind, and which was translated into the English language as part of the African and Black people studies. He has the accolade of creative people and from the Gulf region in intellectual production, and he is member of the board of jury for many prizes. He authored recently the Banyan Chronicle in 2023, and other references about nationalism and the Ummah, the nation. And his latest publication is Poor Industries, which was published in 2024, last year. Welcome, Dr. Nader. We have the pleasure of having you. Welcome to the Arab Center for Research. Please go ahead. You have 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will start receiving questions from from the attendees. Thank you very much, my dear friend, Dr. Haider. I thank the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies Unit and the Arab Center and all the friends who have helped me to organize and prepare for this lecture. I'm really grateful for Dr. Haider for this, for receiving me, generously receiving me here. The topic of my lecture is about a group of traders who are Hindus and Indians who resided in the Gulf for centuries now, and they dominated the trade in main harbors and ports in the Gulf for long centuries as well. Uh, Despite that, the history of this group in the Gulf reveals to what extent the tables turn in history and roles are reversed in history in a dramatic and tragic way. This group was once dominating the trade in the Gulf throughout centuries, as I claim. I claim since the 10th century until the mid 21st century. The trade was dominated by this group, and then this group, with the changes and fluctuations that happened in the first half of the 20th century, this group turned into a minority, a small minority. They are very small in numbers, around hundreds, and at maximum they are in the hundreds, and they still reside in the Gulf, specifically the cities where they resided for, such as Manama, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and of course Muscat, and the main cities where they have resided, and previously Basra, and cities along the eastern coast, starting from Hormuz, Bandar Abbas, the island of Kish, and a city called Siraf, which is now called Tahir, the coast of Persia. So how did their roles change and their stand changed from a group that controlled trade in the region into a small group that occupies the role of any small community in the Gulf region? And to what extent is the scene reversed in relation to the perception of these groups after the oil boom, before and after the oil boom in the Gulf region? The conception and the image of the Indian groups started from the 70s and afterwards. Before the 70s, there was a different affair completely. I have an investigation about how the conception of the Indian groups changed in the Gulf region. It started centuries ago when this group resided here, which the group which I'm addressing here, they were at the highlighted in the scene, on the arena in the Gulf region. So the Indians had a sophisticated image, carried a sophisticated image conception, such as the Europeans and advanced countries in the minds of the people of the Gulf region, such as how the people of the Gulf think of Europeans nowadays. So this group dominated trade at the time, and then there was a small transformation with the discovering of oil, and as the great corporations started working in Bahrain, they needed technical expertise to work at their companies, and so they hired a huge number of Indians from the middle class. They are not really traders of deep roots in the Gulf, and they got huge numbers of Indians. And then the people of the Gulf felt competition, that these people are taking away the job opportunities that were supposed to be for the people of the Gulf. And the first political movement in the history of Bahrain happened in 1930, and this was based on this spark. This was the spark. The national demands movement was based on the sensitivity towards the preferring the foreign workers compared to the nationals. And so the oil boom started, and huge numbers of Indian workers from lower classes or who were underprivileged started flowing into the Gulf region, and so these cities started having overcrowded neighborhoods that hosted or housed these minorities, and thus the conception changed. And so the topic will be about this group, and we will move on to an era that is before the oil boom, before discovering oil in the Gulf, and arriving at the oil boom and the changes that happened during that era. And to which time does the connection of the main harbors and ports in the Gulf starts? The history starts in these harbors. What we know that the trade relations and the connection with India goes back in time to the 3rd or 4th century, and it's related to the old trade line or route in Mesopotamia and Iraq, and then India and Sindh, and the main harbors were the port of Oman. There was Sormer, Majan in Oman. They were connected directly to a trade route that is deep rooted in history, and it is difficult to identify a point in time where this started. But what is documented and what is proven about this connection is the material evidence is limited. The material evidence that we have is limited. We have discovered some artifacts in the countries of the Gulf region, in several countries of the Gulf region. However, I will mention some indicators that show, at least in the first Islamic era, that there was a relation between the Gulf and the India region, where the Arab language scholars started documenting the grammatical rules of the Arabic language, and they have specified a timeline and the whereabouts as well that we can use in the Arabic language, which they call the times, the era of citation and argumentation. So if we are to ask if the Arabs have used this term or not, to whom do we refer? So they agreed that 150 Hijra is the point in time where we can use evidence for citation, and before that we cannot use any pieces of evidence. So, and the specification of the tribes that were used for citation, there is a talk about we cannot use tribes for citation in Bahrain and Oman. We cannot use what was said by Arab tribes, even though they are Arab tribes. Abd Tamim, Azd, Abu Bakr, Wa'il, they are all deep-rooted Arab tribes in these countries. They cannot be used for citation. The reason for that is that they socialized with Persians and Indians, and so this issue of race purity is not existent. This shows that there is a close connection to the point where their language was affected. And in the Umayyad poet Jarir, who died 110 Hijri, he recites poetry that mentions ships coming from India and Sindh. He says that they look like camels coming from India in an area called Qaru, or going from Awal, Bahrain to India. This shows that there is a deep-rooted, strong connection between the Gulf region and India, to the point where language was even influenced, and not just language, even our architecture, our attire, and many things in the coastal area of the Gulf, and all the main cities in the Gulf were heavily influenced by India in terms of attire, empire, in terms of language, in terms of architecture, in terms of cuisine. So the Gulf cuisine is influenced by many regions, but specifically by India. It was deeply influenced by India, and it is difficult to separate it from the Indian cuisine. For example, the rice meal in the Gulf was not an essential meal in the Gulf region before. It became a main meal because of the Banyan group. They were the traders who monopolized the trade of rice, and they started importing huge amounts of rice, and then it became the main meal in the Gulf region. And then we have the spice, the biryani, sambusa, chapati, and all of these are of Indian origins. Even as for language, most of the dialects of the coast of the Gulf region have some sort of influence. Samuel Bejan, when he came to Bahrain, he noticed that the dialect of the people of Bahrain is influenced by the Indian language, or the Hindi language. For example, today we still use words that come from Hindi, such as uri, which means boat, and the fruit that we imported from India, like santara, which means mandarins, and kishmish, hamba, chico. These are all Hindi terms, and we still use them due to that influence. Alu, which means potatoes. Al-Gari, the people of the Gulf use Gari, which is the carriage pushed by the donkey, Shubriya, which is the bed. So most of the tools used to weigh pearls are taken from the Hindi language, and all of the modern tools that appeared in late 19th century, early 20th century, such as the kashma, which is glasses, this is from the Hindi language, the spoon, of course, each country calls it by a different term, but one of the terms is kamcha, which is a word from the Hindi language, and zafra, vanilla, they are of Indian origins. Matta battat, they are playing cards, battat, doors, or the hinges of the door. These all come from the Hindi language, and so many terms come from the Hindi language and that we use in the Gulf region. This shows the deep influence of India and the Gulf region. Where does this influence come from? I believe it comes from this Hindu trade dynasty or group in the Gulf region, which is called Al-Banyan, which dominated and even managed the customs of the trade, and Derham, Muscat, Bandar Abbas, and many cities throughout the years. I could quickly mention the definition of Banyan and where this term comes from. The people of the Gulf use this term. Of course, it is a bit ambiguous, and few people know the meaning of the word Banyan, how it is used, and what is meant by this term. Banyan, it is said that it is of Gujarati Sanskrit origin, which is Vanya or Vanyan, which means a trader. So the word Banyan means trader, and it is written in Latin alphabets in various variations. But not every Indian Hindu trader is Banyan. Banyan in the Gulf region is used as a proper noun to indicate two main groups in the history of the Gulf region who have resided and now settled down in the Gulf region, at least since the 60s of the 20th century. The main towns where the Banyan groups come from are in the west of India. The first group comes from a region in India called Kutch in the province of Gujarat, and the Albanian still reside in Muscat to date. And they are from a group called Al Batia from Kuch. And historically, they dominated the market and the trade of Muscat for many years, for centuries. And the other groups comes from a town that is now in Pakistan, close from Karachi, called Tata. It is not the commercial famous company Tata in Pakistan. No, after independence in 1974, this town became part of Pakistan. They are also Patia and they resided in Bahrain, and then they moved to Dubai, and most of them moved to Dubai in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. And so Albanian is a pronoun to indicate a Hindu Indian group. Alpatia, they originate from Alpatia and Tata and Kuch in Gujarat. So there was a later utilization or use of this term Albanian, specifically in Bengal. Albanian was used to indicate a manager of a European company or a businessman of a European company. And in the history of the business management of these companies, there is a famous person who was illustrated before. His name was Kantu Babu, who was a businessman for an English person. And so Banyan in Bengali is a businessman or a manager. So what is used to nowadays in the Gulf is to indicate these people who came from Sindh, Tata or Gujarata from Kuch.
So the existence of this group in the GCC history was linked to a number of factors, commercial, religious, and also political factors. This is linked to political stability, areas where there is trade, prosperity, there is religious tolerance, and environments that would cater for the usage of guarantees linked to property. So the Banyans were not only traders, they used to be the banks of the GCC when it comes to loans given and any banking transactions, they were controlled by the Banyan. And much of the real estate in Muscat, all of such kind of properties were the result of loans that are given in the form of mortgages that are used by the Banyan. So they had so many impacts on many regions and they have settled in those areas. So this group of factors that attracted this group of people used to move from one city to another. And in actual fact, there is an accurate history about the movement of the different train centers starting from the 12th century up until mid 20th century, the movement of these trade centers. But the situation is not very clear when it comes to the era prior to that. We did not know how trade was managed then, but there are indicators that show that Basra used to be a trade hub. So all the goods and merchandise would be shipped into Basra and from there to India and China. And the same applies to merchandise coming from India and China, coming to the main hub in Basra, and therefore moving to other commercial hubs in the GCC up until the 20th century. After the destruction of Basra, after the revolution that happened in the 9th century, with this destruction, the main central city of commerce became the city of Siraf, which is a Tahir city in Iran. And we know in Arab history up to now, so we have histories of many, many chronicles of many persons date back to those areas. Those Sirafis have contributed a great deal to production during those eras, 10th and 11th centuries. The reason is that Siraf became the commercial hub of the GCC. Yaqut al-Hamawi, as an example, who came a century after the prosperity of Siraf. While describing Siraf, he said that Siraf is the area from which goods would be shipped into other areas. So goods would not be shipped directly from Muscat to India. There was a center where such goods would be compiled, and from there it would be distributed to the other areas. So Siraf used to be considered the main hub of trade in the region. And we do not know if Banyans were in Siraf, but in the book Akhbar al-Hind and Sea and China by Abu Zaid as-Sayrafi, Abu Zaid described the prosperity of Siraf as a great commercial center akin to many, many other similar centers in the region. And many of the goods that used to be shipped through the port of Siraf. He talked about traders, elders, and leaders when they would invite the Hindu traders into Siraf. They would need to present to them, to invite them to in excess of 100 plates of food, and Hindus would not, I mean, no more than two persons would be eating from one dish. So many of those traders perhaps are from Banyan or not, but I do think that they come from Banyan. So this is just an introduction to the lecture, but there is a book, if you excuse me because I'm taking too long, but there is a book that is very, very interesting indeed. It is no less important than ألف ليلة or وليلة, the 1001 nights. So it is by Buzurd bin Shahryar. He authored a book, and it is a book of wonders about a man marrying a monkey, and a woman marrying a snake with three heads. This is similar to stories of 1001 Nights, and it is a book about narrators coming from different areas, and that I have met this narrator coming from Siraf, and so on and so forth. There are so many indications in that book, and those who are interested in the book, which is The Wonders of India, they interpreted the book in a way that was not very accurate. In most of the stories of The Wonders of India, he talked about the Banyanian aspect or attributes of those ships or boats. They're talking about Bunyan, which is buildings. And those who were interested in the book of Sin, they thought that Bunyan, Banyan, and Banania is another word to describe sailors, but it was very clear from the stories that were recounted is that they were talking about a Hindu group that used to give they would give sacrifices to the gods. So the Banyans, they were in the GCC, and at least starting from the 10th century. So the most important reference that would document the word, the term itself, the term appeared and entered the Western dictionaries in the 16th centuries when the Portuguese started communicating with the Indians. And the term started being used in Portugal, reflecting the meaning of a trader. And after that, it entered the English language, but in Arabic this appeared at least as early as the 10th century. And there are so many documents that talk about Janizat al-Qahira. These were the books that were, or papers that were kept close to the Jewish synagogue in Cairo and would never have been thrown away for religious reasons. One of those documents dates back to the 11th century, and there is a reference to Al Banyan or Al Banyani in reference to a Banyan person. These are references that show that the Banyan existed in the GCC as early as the 10th century at least. So they used to move from one area to another, and this is due to the central importance of this region. Siraf, at the end of the 10th century, early 11th century, it was subjected to an earthquake, and after that they moved to Kish or Qis, and this is an island that used to be described by Ibn Athir as the area that was very important indeed. So the island of Kish controlled the most important commercial hubs. So in the 12th and 13th century, the ruler of Kish used to own two-thirds of the revenues coming from Bahrain. And most of the traders, they moved to Qais or Kish island up until competition erupted between Hormuz and Qais, particularly in the 14th century. And after that, we have seen that the center has become the Hormuz Strait, that has become the greatest strait or port up until the 17th century. So Hormuz was destroyed as a result of an alliance between the British and the Safawids, and then the center moved to Bandar Abbas. In the mid 16th century, the image became very, very clear because the Portuguese archive clarified everything about the hegemony and control of Banyan in the GCC region, up to the extent where the trade by Portugal was always passing through the Banyan in a way or another, particularly those Banyans coming from the region of Tata. And before I move to the other cities and enter into the main topic, there is an indication in the history of Oman, as Ibn Ruziq narrated about the history of Oman. He said the story that documents the history, the exit of the Portuguese from Oman in 1650, whereby there was a story that was recounted about the weight and the role played by the Banyan in the GCC and Oman in particular. And the commander of the Portuguese fortress in Muscat fell in love with the daughter of one of the Banyan people in Oman, in Muscat, and he wanted to marry her. And the Banyan, for religious reasons, they would not accept giving their daughters in marriage for religious reasons. Those people eat pork and so on, and therefore this would not be accepted. So the Portuguese ruler insisted to marry the daughter, and he was not able to find any other solution. And this is part of a traditional popular story, and he accepted and said, in principle I accept. And he said, let's remove all the goods from the fortress, let's clean the fortress, until one Sunday when everybody was on holiday and they were drunk, and the attack started. They started attacking the fortress and they controlled the fortress, and the Portuguese were expelled as a result of that. So the most important group when it comes to Banyan are Banyans that come from Tata. One of the eminent researchers who specialized in the history of Banyan in Oman, he found that this Banyan group came from Tata and Sindh and not from Gujarat, as it was mentioned. So after the destruction of Kish Island, the center moved to Bandar Abbas, and that was in the 17th century, where 3,000 Banyan resided in Bandar Abbas, and this was the end of the Safawi dynasty and the collapse of the Shah dynasty. So the main center became Muscat, as it was expressed by a traveler, British traveler, Bill Griff. He said that this is the gateway to the east par excellence. So Muscat at the time included all traders coming from all parts of the world, and he was a very meticulous historian that documented the history of those centuries starting from the 18th century. So 1860 is a very important date when it comes to the history of the Banyan. After the toppling of Sultan Salim bin Thuwaini's rule at the time, and after Imam Azzam bin Qais came into power, so the ruling became much more restricted in terms of attire, in terms of appearance, in terms of beards, wearing a beard or not wearing a beard, and also music and so on and so forth. So there have been a lot of restrictions, and many of those traders, they traveled leaving Muscat. There is an indication showing that in 1809 there was an Italian traveler, and he used to be a doctor or physician for Al Said. So he said that at the time there were approximately 4,000 Banyan, and in 1870 only 250 Banyans remained. So the largest number of Banyans, they moved to other areas. So the main center became Manama. They became the commercial center of pearl trade in the GC. It is no exaggeration if we say that Bahrain used to be the center of pearl trade in the whole world, and not only in the GCC. It controlled such trade in a way that was huge, and we have seen the expansion of such kind of trade, particularly with India, and 50% of Bahrain trade used to be with India, and 65% of Bahraini exports was towards India, and it became the hub of trade in that particular era. And also it was India, of course, it used to be the hub of science and technology and the discoveries that the GCC people used to be very proud of, because those discoveries used to come from India in those years. So this is a panoramic kind of general view about how the trade centers moved from one area to another in the GCC. The number of Banyan in Bahrain up until 1950, that number was very limited indeed. And this was really strange. So the oldest indication to the specific number of Banyans in the market of Manama dates back to 1920, when George Brooks tried to survey the GCC, and he said there are 100 Banyans in the market of Manama that own shops in that particular market. And also we had the GCC guide of Laurie Boriner. He said that the Banyan in Manama are about 175 in the market of Manama. And after that, in the 40s of the 20th century, where we had the first official census that was conducted in Bahrain, they realized that there was about 447 Banyans residing in Manama. And after that, in 1950, the number increased to reach 2,000, sorry. So this shows the difference between the Banyan in Muscat and in Bahrain. So after the 1960s, there were no problems faced by the Banyan. Those who stayed in Muscat continued, and their grandchildren still live in Muscat up to date, till dates. They still keep their trade, and they're still living in Bahrain, in Oman. And their country of origin is Koot in Gujarat, and it follows India, and they have no
problem whatsoever. They have no kind of tragic turning point in their history, and that their country has become part of the of Pakistan, Muslim Pakistan, after the division. So all of them have left in a mass exodus, and they left to go to that area. So when I try to analyze this huge increase in the number of Banyan, this is due to the fact that they lost their homeland, and due to the fact that they wanted to transform Manama to make it their own alternative homeland where they can be able to settle with their families and children. So there are a number of secondary kind of indicators that underline this particular idea. There are so many indicators in the different archives and chronicles that show that the existence of Banyan in the region. So when we talk about the Banyan, for your attention, this is a commercial network that expands in the whole GCC basin into the Arab Sea to East Africa. So this is a group. So it used to be the one controlling the area. We're talking about Albanian, and through this network, money, the loan system, credit system, and goods, all of them used to go through this network through family members that would be in charge of companies in that area or that area in Bahrain, in Karachi. So this used to be a very branched out kind of network that managed the history of trade in the region throughout the centuries. But what is sure is that the history of this group is a patriarchal kind of history. All of them are men, brothers, and sons. And it was rare when women accompanied them. There is an indication about Tata, the homeland or the country of origin of those Banyans. It used to be a city or as a community that is full only of women, only women and children and old men. So 90% of the population of Tata used to be women, children, and old men and women. But their men, young men, they spread out in different parts of the world for commercial and trade reasons. So after the first census that was conducted in Bahrain. So the political agent opened or inaugurated a school for the Indians, and he moved from one area to another, meeting the Hindus that used to live in Bahrain in order to talk about an idea, because they wanted to cover for the expenses in order to open that school, so a rupiah or two, in order to, monthly allocation to that particular school. And they realized that the number of children was not enough to open a whole school. They only had 20 children that would come seasonally to Bahrain and then leave. And the idea was nipped in the bud as a result of that. When did we have a school? When we had enough children for whom a school can be built, and when those Banyans started thinking about Manama as an alternative homeland. And this happened after 1947 when they lost their homeland, and after that they moved to Manama to consider it their alternative homeland, and an Indian school was inaugurated in 1957, and we have thousands of Indian students who study in Bahrain, and that school still exists, and it has two branches in two different areas in Bahrain. This is one of the schools in which the curricula are very, very strong, very even Bahraini families, when they think about taking their children to Indian schools in Bahrain, and what they think about first is not the fees that they would need to pay for that particular school, but the level of effort they should exert with their children in order for them to be up to the level presented by that particular school. So after European companies, after the Portuguese came to Hormuz and then Muscat and Bahrain in 1521, all the indicators showed that they were there and they were managing a good trade in many regions. And there are indicators also that Alfonso, the Portuguese commander that came to the GCC, it was said that the number of spoils he got from Khorfakan was very, very limited because the Banyan left, they ran away before they arrived. There is a report that dates back to 1521. There is an indicator showing that amongst the spoils that they were able to get, 22 were amongst them were 22 banyans, and they were indicators that one or two of them were sold in Hormuz market. This is testament to the fact that they existed in those particular region. But the arrival of the Portuguese deepened the existence of the banyan in the region, facilitated it. So also we had the Indian Dutch company, the Indian British company, all of them relied on the Banyan as commercial agents, as interpreters, as brokers for those people who did not know much about the area. We had the Eastern Dutch Indian Company that came to the region, particularly to Bandar Abbas, and they opened their agency in 1620 for commercial reasons because they wanted to have their trade with Persia for silk and so on and so forth. And in 1643, it seems they started thinking about pearl trade and they wanted to venture with pearl trade. So the director of the company, and there is a letter that is kept in the Dutch archive, and I mentioned it in my book, the book I authored about the Banyan. He asked the employee in a company to accompany this particular Banyan to go to the Manama or Bahrain market. There was no clear reference to Al-Manama, but to Al-Bahrain, and that he would be catering for all his needs, including accommodation, food, and so on and so forth, in order to buy samples of pearls they wish to trade, to use in trade. So the representative of the British or the agent in the GCC. Even the use of the term wakil or agent comes from the commercial context, commercial agent. In 1816, when we had the first commercial agent in the GCC, history of the GCC, was appointed in Bahrain first and foremost. So Bruce was the political resident, and after that, he discussed with the rulers of Bahrain and he said, let's open a route linking Bahrain to India. And he was appointed as commercial trader. So he was appointed as a commercial trader. And his name remained so. And the reason this was linked to the trade agency that was allocated or given to the Banyan. So in the GCC, for instance, from the most important countries that had their own political agents, so countries such as Bahrain, Ash-Shariqa, Muscat. In one of the years, there were two brothers, one in charge of Bahrain and one in charge of Muscat, from Suda Gulab family, Suda Alandadas and Bulam Adandadas. These were two brothers that were in charge of the British agency in Bahrain and Muscat. So the companies coming from different countries worked through the Banyan, and some Banyan groups played political roles because the British did not ask them to be only commercial agents, but also they played a political role through the writing of reports about the history of the country and what is happening in the country until the British ships entered into Bahrain due to a wrong report about what was happening. So the agency was dissolved and they stopped dealing with them as agents for many reasons. And after that, a local agency started and they had their own British forces that were in charge of that in Bahrain.
the clear image of the spreading of banyans in the region, starting from the Red Sea and to the east and in the Gulf, comes in the 18th century from an important traveler that documented everything in the Red Sea, the German traveler Christian Nabidor, which was part of the German delegation, who started traveling from 1961 until 1967. This was a trip to collect evidence and document evidence in the region. This trip starts from the Suez Channel into Jeddah and the regions or areas of Yemen. He documents what he saw, and he documents that in every region he arrives in, there are banyans. For example, he says that he starts in Yemen. He says in the area of Luhya, there are 40 banyans. In Beit al-Faqih, these are areas in Yemen, on the coast of Yemen, there are 120 banyans. Sana'a, 100 in Beit al-Faqih, and 125 in Sana'a, 700 in al-Mukha. As for the largest number of banyans in all of this commercial network was in Muscat, 1,200 banyans in Muscat. This indicates that he saw the largest number of banyans in Muscat. This indicates that they monopolized trade in Muscat. They had their freedom of worship. They had their temples. They had their cows and their icons, which we deem as idols, as Arab, pagan idols as Arabs, but they had their temples where they practiced their religion freely. This was in the Busaidi dynasty era. Ahmed bin Said, the founder of the state, the Busaidi dynasty in the state. And then in the 19th century we have an equally accurate description which comes from Captain George Brooks, an officer in the Indian naval forces at the time, who was interested in the history of the Gulf, and the Gulf owes him a huge credit because he documented everything that he saw in this entire basin, in this region. He documented in detail the harbors, the ports, the coasts, the customs of people, their language, their demographic composition. And so George Brooks was the first person who demonstrated the accurate tapestry of the Gulf, because he was in the delegation that scanned, surveyed the region of the Gulf. And there is a famous map of the Gulf that is very important map that accurately describes every island, every harbor, and every area quite accurately. That is unprecedented, actually. And George Brooks was the first person who drew the form of Bahrain in the form that we are familiar now. The form, the illustration that we are familiar with today, was first illustrated in 1825 in the map of George Brooks. And before that, Bahrain was drawn as two vertical islands, but his surveys and his illustrations were accurate. And so he described his what he saw in the Gulf during his surveys, which he conducted upon the request of the Eastern Indian British Company. He noted that Manama housed hundreds of Banyan traders. He found Banyans in Abu Dhabi. He found Banyans in Khorfakkan. He encountered Banyans in Sharjah. This he said that they wore the Arab attire and acted as Arabs. He found 1,000 Banyans in Oman, 2,000 Banyans in Muscat, and a few Banyans in Bandar Abbas. And so this was the limitation of their spreading or branching out in the region. And there were quite other citations of their existence later on. The most important question here, in my opinion, which I will use to conclude this lecture, is when exactly did this commercial domination and power that was monopolized by the group. There are indications that in the 19th century that this group was dominating the pearl trade in the Gulf, which was the main trade in the Gulf. So how did their domination and their power take a step back? How did it start decreasing in the commercial arena in the Gulf region? In my estimation, the context of the Banyans in Muscat is different from the context in Bahrain. However, there are some things in common between the two. One of these things, the factors, which is was the commercial competition. At one point, the Banyans in Bahrain, for example, dominated 70% of the trade of Bahrain. 70% of importation, exportation was dominated by Banyans. They controlled 95% of re-exportation. So it was the main market that exported goods into Qatar and the Gulf. For example, إحساء القطيع, the goods came from Bahrain and then exported again. And so this trade was dominated by Banyans until late 19th century, and then it was taken away from them, or the Arab traders in Bahrain started competing with them. For example, 60% of the trade of rice in the market of Bahrain and even the region around Bahrain was dominated by one company, Banyan company, called Damanmal Asserdas, and this was the name of the company, and it was the name of the leader of Banyans. It was dominating 60% of the rice trade in the region, and then the Arab traders, locals, Persians, and traders in the Gulf market started taking away huge shares of the trade, specifically related to importation, exportation, and re-exportation. And the more important thing is related to the collapse of the pearl trade in the Gulf after discovering lab-made pearls and that coming into the market. This affected this group and helped in their the fall of this group. We can read some complaints to the resident and to the agent, the British agent, saying that this trade is going out of our hands. They are asking the British to intervene directly to prevent that. So there was also the global depression in the 20s, which affected the Banyans, and there was the Belgrave, something that Belgrave indicated. The British advisor to the government of Bahrain until 1957, Belgrave thought or believed that these complaints should not be taken into consideration because the priority should go to the people of the country, the people of the states, that you Banyans are guests and you are traders, but all of the money is taken away to the Sind and it's not benefiting the nationals of the state. And so in the 20s of the 20th century, they started preferring the nationalistic element, the Arab element, to get the benefits of the resources in this region. There's another thing that is related to withdrawing the management of customs from their hands. The customs of Muscat, it was managed for a long time by Banyans. They controlled it by rentals. So the Sultan or the Sheikh would agree with them to pay them a certain amount of money and they would manage these customs. And so they managed that from 1888, and then in 1923 this was taken away from this responsibility was taken away from them, and they have faced a huge problem after that. I will give you a problem of the an example of the problems. They traded velvet with Qatar, or sorry, they traded with the city of Al Qatif and Al Qatar, and so they relied on re-exportation of commodities, but then they lost their agent in Al Qatif, and their commodities stayed a long time in the harbor, and so the tax used to be 2% for re-exportation from Al Qatif. So throughout 20 days, days, it's 2%. After that, it's 50%. And so their commodities stayed a long time in the harbor, and they had to pay 5% for customs. And the other traders who had agents in the eastern area, they paid only 2%, though their prices are lower. And so they started facing problems as such. And there is also during this era, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s of the 20th century, with the nationalistic extension in the Gulf region, they started to the Arabs started having a negative image or conception of foreigners, specifically those who were controlling the pivotal sectors such as banking, customs, company, as well as the other companies. They started having negative conceptions of foreigners. There was some sort of xenophobia that was starting to form at the time. But the pivotal turn in this history was the independence of India. Of course, it has its positive effects on the people of India, but it was a curse for Albanian traders. With the independence of India and the loss of the original homeland of some of the Banyans, with this independence, they lost the main support coming from the British as subjects of the British Empire, and they were even getting preferential treatment from the British. But now, at this point, they became one of the regular minorities, trader minorities that resided in the Gulf region. And so Dr. Haider is informing me that we're out of time. But despite that, this group remains in the history of the Gulf a main testament to the what we can call a deep-rooted diversity in the Gulf Coast. Distinguished it from other areas. You find the Jews, you find Persians, you find Christians, all grouped in one market. We had Hindu temples in Muscat, in Al Bahrain, which dates back to 1800. And so having a Hindu temple in the midst of a Muslim Arab countries, you could see, for example, a synagogue or a Christian a church. This is an Abrahamic religion that you can tolerate. However, having a Hindu temple in the traditional understanding of the monotheist Hindu religion as a religion that is different. This shows the high level of tolerance in the region at the time to receive this kind of diversity, which distinguished it throughout long centuries. Thank you, and I am sorry for taking too long in this lecture. Thank you, Dr. Nader, for this valuable lecture. I believe we will have many questions and remarks from our attendees. I can see many raised hands. Let me start by stressing that this lecture is being presented from Doha, Qatar. However, you did not mention anything about Banyans in Qatar. Perhaps you can mention some indication of that. Another thing that I want to ask about is that it is a two-part question. It seems that you talked about a group that was residing independently in the region without interacting with the local community. And I believe that this is a systemic problem in the studies of the Gulf region. The fact that this region is hosting so many communities and minorities since the oil boom, but we're still studying them as if there is a group of citizens living autonomously without the essential interaction with the local community. To what extent, this is the question that I want to ask about the Banyans specifically, to what extent were they interacting with the local community? And another thing that I want to ask about, to what extent was the ascent and descent of the Banyans affected or influenced by the colonialist impact in the region? So we could hypothesize that there is the Indian Ocean space, but if it's a movement of trade and commercial movement, why is it hinged upon harbors as well? So why was it influenced by the British colonialism? So there is discussion about that. And also the interaction with the local community and with the formation of mashiachas, or the tribal leaders, tribal leadership. Where does this group lie? We will start receiving questions. We'll start with our student Salman, a Bahraini student that we have here, then Dr. Ali and Dr. Mustafa, Mr. Ibrahim, and so let's start. Hello. I believe that my question is very close to the question of Dr. Haider. Banyan is a commercial power in the Gulf region, be it before the British colonialism or after the British colonialism, and perhaps if there are indications of their existence during the Portuguese existence. Do you categorize them as a functional group under the British colonialism in general, their relation to power at the time? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nader, for this valuable lecture. Indeed, it was excellent. Thank you, Dr. Haider, for the introduction as well and the facilitation. First, I have a remark and then two questions. For the decrease of numbers of Banyans in Muscat between 1805 and 1870 to 250, but in 1825, it was indicated that there was 2,000 Banyans. So the decrease started after 1825. You have attributed that to the mistreatment, the bad treatment they had from the Sultan of Muscat. But if we are to think more about that, in 1820 there was the agreement of protection. So why didn't that play a part of that? And then there was an agreement that was signed with the French in Mauritius that was known as the agreement of 1809. This maybe perhaps that agreement was a reason for the decrease and not the mistreatment by the Sultan. Another question is, why did the Brits protect Banyans? You mentioned that they resided here since the 10th century. So why, when the Brits arrived in the Gulf, they sponsored or protected the Banyans? Is it because of the fact that India was colonized by the British Empire, and so they were subjects of the British monarchy, or was it that they had other colonialist objectives in order to intervene in the affairs of the tribal leaders or to get information, especially that they submitted some intelligence reports about the harbors and ports in the Gulf region. Last question, were all the Banyans Hindus or did they include other religions? And are these other religions, were there these other religions protected by the British? Was the British protection exclusive to the Hindu traders only? Thank you, Dr. Haider, and thank you very much, Dr. Nader, for this valuable lecture. Indeed, you have mentioned all details of the subject, so thank you so much. Thank you. So, Dr. Haider said that certainly there were Banyans in Qatar. Of course, I don't know about the details of the role, but Sheikh Jassim mentioned that they have had a role in the Qatari history, and he tried to strike an agreement between them and local traders. When Sheikh Abdullah bin Jassim came along, things changed, especially after the 1916 agreement was made, after the political resident was appointed, and they considered the Banyans subjects of the British Empire. And so it seems that the Sheikh did not agree or did not approve of that agreement, and the result was that there was a crisis between Qatar in general and the Banyans in general. The question is the problems between the Qataris and the Banyans, were they a result of the loans, the excessive loans that were there at the time? We know that local traders started struggling with that problem. Were there similar problems in other Gulf countries, especially after the depression of oil and the agreements that were signed at the time?
Assalamu alaikum. I would like to thank Dr. Haider and Dr. Nadir. I wanted to tackle 2 points, including Qatar. You have one whole chapter that tackles this particular point. So, my question to you, what is the role of the rise of the Bahrag sect in Bahrain and them competing with the Banyans? I remember there was a Bahrag sect, so Al Bahra sect, and perhaps had the upper hand and was important in Bahrain. I would like you, if you can, to cover this particular point. Thank you very much, Dr. Nader. Thank you for this very valuable lecture. You mentioned in your lecture and you described the Banyan as a trade group, and you talked about all their commercial activities. You mentioned all of them, I have to say, but we have to talk about the political awareness amongst the Banyans. Have you seen any political movement amongst the Banyan in the GCC? We know that the Banyan in East Africa had great political control, and they were demanding for political rights, particularly in the 40s during the era when India was liberated. Had we had the same political movement amongst Banyan traders in the GCC? Thank you very much, Dr. Nader. My name is Hani Awad, researcher at the Arab Center. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very rich, full of information that much of which I didn't know. So the title of the lecture is not clear in my head. So what does this history, the history of this minority, Indian minority, what can it tell us about the history of the GCC? What would it change in the historical narrative of this region, the narrative that was written about this particular area? Microphone, please. We kindly ask the speaker to switch on the microphone, please. So the situation in Qatar is very particular when it comes to Albanian in Qatar. The number of Albanian in Qatar was limited, but Britain took advantage of this number of Banyans in Qatar because they tried to have eyes and ears in Qatar through the Banyan. But Qatar did not accept to have a political agent akin to Sharqa or Bahrain or other areas. And from a general reading of the situation, I find that the Banyan in Oman, they were able to mingle with the social fabric of Oman. But the Banyan in Qatar, they had a commercial mission, and at the same time, they played an intelligence role in the region. Sheikh Jassim saw in such presence an economic threat that would impact the economy of the state. So that is why he resisted their presence. And Great Britain stood in the face of such resistance, and they considered Albanian as British subjects. And here it was revealed and made clear that trade was only the facade that was presented to the community, while Albanian were playing a role whereby they would be supporting the interests of Britain in Qatar. The situation in Bahrain is different. Banyan existed for a long period of time in Bahrain. Bruce gave Bahrain to Persia. And after that, they were expelled. So we look at Banyan in Qatar as spies conducting a role against the interests of the state of Qatar. Thank you very much, Dr. Nader, for this presentation. You have opened great prospects to talk about Banyan. You've given us very important details about the history of the Banyan. As a Qatari person, it is very important for me to know the Qatari context and the Banyan. If we take the narrative that you expressed and explained to us, whether this is linked to Oman or Bahrain, we find this narrative different altogether from the narrative in Qatar. And you mentioned and said that citizens in Bahrain realized that the Banyan controlled the trade in Bahrain, and they realized that they had to play a role, and they started intervening for them to secure their own share of the trade. But we find that in Qatar, for instance, this process did not happen as it was intended. So there was an agreement concluded in 1916. One of the items of this agreement is to have some British subjects in Qatar, and these subjects are the Banyan. So they had a number of issues that were thorny in that particular agreement between the state of Qatar and the British. So was Sheikh Jassim and Sheikh Abdullah, were they knowledgeable about what was happening? Was the economic context the impetus behind such kind of decisions? What is the situation in your view? If there are no more questions, perhaps we have a student from Kerala, from India. It is interesting to listen to an Indian perspective. Assalamu alaikum. Muhammad Rashad, a student, comparative literature student. So one of the most important reason of the Banyan's position vis-a-vis the area. So there are a number of traditions that the Hindus follow. If they take the sea, they cannot go back to India. Is this a reason why they went back to Karachi or to Oman and not to India? Is this one of the reasons that made them not go back to India? Since you mentioned that there were many, many Banyans living in both Manama and Muscat at the time. Fawzi, go ahead. Our alumni, many, many questions from our students and alumni. Thank you very much, Dr. Nader. Thank you, Dr. Haider. I have two questions, or maybe a question and a comment. So why we find that there is a kind of ambiguity when it comes to the name of Banyan. Some talk about, they give it different explanations. So there is another thing that I would like to talk about. The Banyans in Yemen. Dr. Nader, you mentioned what Neighbour had said after the occupation of Britain of Aden in 1939. It was visited 1839, and he said, I visited an Indian city on Arab soil due to the number of the Banyan that lived in Yemen. Yasmin Al-Masri. My question is from the perspective of a person who is not knowledgeable about the subject. You mentioned that one of the travelers said visited the region and had seen 40 people. So what is the distinctive attribute of Banyan? Why Banyan in particular, not Indians from other areas? My name is Halima from the history department. I would like to thank the organizers for this valuable lecture. So there is a group when it travels to an area that is not their area of origin, they would face difficulties. Why Britain concentrated on this particular kind of group, and how were they able to continue with their cultural identity in the GCC, particularly in Oman? How were they able to preserve their identity in those areas? I have a question. Have the Banyans become citizens? So have they converted or reverted to Islam? So let's go back to Dr. Nader after this large number of questions. I would like to thank the different guests for their interventions. Microphone, please. I would like to thank you very much for your interventions. Do not expect me to answer each and every question because some of the interventions, in actual fact, gave answers to many of the questions that were posed. So I would like to answer some of the crucial, pivotal questions that were posed and perhaps that were not covered in my presentation. Perhaps I went very, very quickly around this story, try to give you a kind of a panoramic view about the Banyans. So the question about the Banyan in Qatar, and you mentioned the most important details that I have not mentioned in my presentation for a number of reasons. But in 1903, particularly in November, the general ruler of India and the deputy king, they conducted the tour in the GCC and they reached Bahrain. And in Bahrain, the Banyan traders wrote a letter that is still in the British archive. This letter revealed a great deal about their history in the GCC. In that particular letter, they told the general ruler that we are traders in the GCC and we manage the trade. We have been doing so for 2 centuries and we've been living in this area for quite some time. But also they mentioned and they asked the general ruler while he was visiting the GCC to intervene in order to open 2 markets, the Qatari and the Qatif markets. And they have been expelled from the market in Qatar. They continued in the 1950s. They have not been allowed into Qatar. And they try to communicate with the Qatari market on different occasions, particularly the Banyans coming from Bahrain. So the company existed in Bahrain and they wanted to expand their activities in Bida and perhaps go back to Bahrain. But they faced an unlimited number of problems. In the first chapter, the chapter that was dedicated to the Banyans in Qatar, they ventured to the extent where some of them lost their lives as a result of that. And I mentioned in the prelude to chapter talking about Qatar, so talking about capital, the cowardice of capital, or the capital or capital is coward. But this did not apply to the Banyan because they were able to enter even the markets that did not welcome them. This is the first point. So they faced many problematics in 1872 and also in 1882 and also 1887. So the incident in 1882 was very, very famous because the agent came to Sheikh Jassim in order to find a solution to the problem. And Sheikh Jassim objected to that a great deal, and there is an indication. The political agent in Bahrain told Sheikh Jassim, this was in 1882, you would like to become a second Arabi that existed in Egypt. He said that we are 2 Arabis and not only one. And after that, they were completely expelled and they did not have any opportunity in Qatar. They always aspired to have business in Qatar. And they have been calling for the political residents and agents to open the door for them to be able to have business and trade in Qatar, but this was not solved. So the agreement that was concluded in 1916 with Sheikh Jassim, Abdullah bin Jassim. So this agreement was very much welcomed by the Banyan to give protection to British citizens or subjects, but the ruler then in Qatar had reservations, and this opened a small door for them. And there was an indication in 1926 they wanted to work in order to re-export. So merchandise would come to Bahrain and then would be re-exported to a local agent. And even during that, they faced a problem. So the Banyan discovered that Dubai port does not take big taxes. So that is why Qatari traders used to use the Dubai port as an alternative, but talking about the reasons and the details and so on and so forth, perhaps we can talk at great length about that. But in my view, there was a commercial competition. So there was a fear about commercial competition that was represented by the Banyan. As a result of that, this was confronted. So the countries that really control their own markets did not have any problem. Kuwait did not have the Banyan. It was a huge market, but despite all that, they did not have the Banyan. But in Iraq, historically speaking, the Banyan resided in Iraq. Al-Ya'arib, when they were helped by the Banyan in order to expel the Portuguese. So they gave the Banyan freedom of worship, and also to the icon of the god that was erected came from a place of worship in Basra. James Buckingham visited Basra and he found many, many Banyan traders. And old Banyan are still there, particularly in the areas close to Basra. They remember the name of Banyans, but they do not know exactly what it means. But these are what remained of this group that resided and lived in Basra. When it comes to interaction with the community, do they have any political interventions or interference in political matters? And here I would like to differentiate between Muscat, the Banyan of Muscat and the Banyan of Bahrain. The Banyan of Bahrain, they were absolute traders that had nothing to do with any political matters. These were very cautious traders that did not interfere, at least historically speaking, they did not interfere in any political matters or social issues. They remained a very cautious group that opened up on the community of traders in Manama, Bahrainis and non-Bahrainis. Till now, the relationship with this group is with the old elite of traders. So they are still in a close relationship with them. They visit them in the Diwali feast and holy feast. So they exchange visits and so on amongst these two groups. We're talking about Manama traders. And consequently, they did not have a clear political position. But starting from the 20s of the 20th century, we have seen a new form of solidarity with the Gandhi movement. So they, in 1948, in the Hindu place of worship, they had a ceremony after the death of Gandhi, but the Banyans of Muscat, they participated in the salt revolution, and also they were very proud Hindus. They used to proud Indians. They even rejected the British citizenship and they wanted to keep their own Indian citizenship. So the context is different. I do not know what happened. Is it because of the deaths of India because the families still live in India? I do not know what the reason was. And this is what the Banyans of Muscat faced. So the Banyans in the GCC and in particular in Bahrain, they played a very important role in managing the affairs of the city. They were only in Manama and not in other areas. In the 20th century, they entered into Al Muharraq and they owned some real estate over there where they started some businesses. So also they were part of dispute resolution teams and groups, and they were the strongest in those gatherings that are local, whose members are appointed by the ruler of Bahrain in order to uh, find solutions or to try to look into disputes that might arise. So this is an indication to the transformation of how Banyans look at their own identity, how they looked at themselves. So these cities, such as Muscat and Manama, and now Dubai, for instance, but historically speaking, we talk about Muscat and Manama. These were two cosmopolitan cities, global cosmopolitan cities, where we see the whole world represented in those particular cities, where they had the Buhra, the Hindus, traders, Muslim Indian traders, Persian traders, Jewish Iraqi traders, and traders from Najd, from Al-Ahsa, from Al-Qatif, Christian Iraqi traders from the coast of Africa. There was an Indian German company, British company, and also there was also a community from the US and so on. So these groups and membership to these groups was not local versus foreigner. So these groups lived in those cities as sons and daughters of those cities, and they managed the affairs of those cities as part and parcel of their duty. So this is a kind of a surplus of the value of the trade that was carried out. Yes, they conducted trade, but there's something that was a kind of a surplus in addition to the profit gained by the trader, in addition to the merchandise. This is the surplus. These were the people who have invested as a result of that and established institutions. They played a role in establishing one of the most modern and important hospitals in the region. We talk about Victoria Hospital that was established there when in commemoration of the death of Queen Victoria. So the Banyan went to the agents, British agents, where then there was no hospitals then, so they went to the British political agent and said, this is 5,000 rupees and we'd like to establish a hospital in commemoration of Queen Victoria, and we'll call it Victoria Hospital. It was established in 1905 and it's kept on working until the 40s of the 20th century. They also played a role in municipal activities as a means of managing local affairs. So this is not only something to do with the management of not only limited to waste management or a management system, but also they had a kind of a group quota system. So the Arabs had the quota, the Bahraini had a quota, the Hindus had a quota. So each one of them had a share. So they entered as being part and parcel of the residents of Manama. But what happened was negative when it comes to the journey of this particular group. Why? There was a law that was issued in 1913, which is Order in Council. So this is a system to manage the occupied territories outside the borders of Great Britain, and the municipal council and the customary council, the members of those two councils, half of them would be appointed by the British agent and the other half would be appointed by the ruler of Bahrain, and these were the citizens of Bahrain, and the ones appointed by the agent were foreigners living in Bahrain, but they were not designated as foreigners, but they were part and parcel of the fabric of Bahrain. But this was a turning point when it comes to the history of the Banyan group. So the influence of the Banyan group, was it linked to colonialism, British, Portuguese, and Dutch colonial power? They existed even prior to the coming of the Portuguese. Yes, they were able to get preference and preferential treatment. They got protection in areas where their merchandise would be stolen or loans would not be paid. The British would intervene to pay those loans and also to make them regain and retrieve what they lost. So such kind of things were secured because they were tools in the hands of the British, functional tools? No, absolutely not. But even the British were very much sensitive vis-à-vis this particular group. They did not look at them as an expansion or extension of the British. They looked at them as traders. So their presence started dwindling and regressing, not because of the colonial power or the agreement that was concluded to protect them in 1971. No, their influence started regressing due to local context and changes happening locally, and also linked to the independence of their country, India. And this had nothing to do with Britain. Why? The British would have been able to keep their influence running until the 70s and give them this kind of preferential treat them had they been spies working for the British. So when the political agency was established, yes, they were asked to play a political role to write reports about the political power, about the ships and also ports. Yes, reports were written and were sent to the political residents, but such role ended, and they have been paying a very huge price as a result of that. Their role has come to an end, and they played a particular commercial role. Is this linked to the sheikhdoms in the GCC? Yes, they monopolized the trade in the ports of the GCC. They used to give loans to certain leaders and elders in the GCC, some rulers in the GCC, particularly in Oman. So they used to entrust the Banyan with their funds. Faisal bin Turki, up until the 20th century and afterwards, their funds were managed by the Banyan. And in indication to the Banyan that used to manage the property of Said bin Taymour, Sultan Said bin Taymour. after the advent of Sultan Qaboos and became the Sultan of Oman, they came to him and they said that these are properties that belong to your father, and Sultan Qaboos never knew about that. So this was regained by Sultan Qaboos. So they had a close relationship. When there is a political rule, there is also a kind of an economic rule of the markets. They control the markets, they deal and manage the customs and the markets. So when we talk about the sheikdoms in the GCC before the establishment of the modern state, so the institutions, the states that is deeply rooted in the different parts of the state. So the economic dimension was very much controlled by those Banyans. The ruler, the political ruler, had only a limited influence. If you want me to conclude, I can do so. Dr. Haidar, one last question. So one last question. There are many, many questions. There was a question. So the intersection between the history of the Banyan and the GCC. I would like to recount to you the story why I am interested in this particular subject. One of you was surprised. Why am I, or why was I interested in the history of this group? Because in actual fact, similar to Dr. Haider, we try to specialize in different disciplines without caring about the limits or of those disciplines. I authored a book entitled Nobody Sleeps in Manama. This book about how Al-Manama was formed and up until 1846, from 1846 up until the last decades, up until the beginning of the 21st century. Why was I interested in Al-Manama? Because Al-Manama was the only city in the GCC that has sectarian, racial diversity, which was not the case in many, many GCC cities. Al-Manama, city of Manama, was very, very small. We're talking about 2 square kilometers, and this city included Sunni and Shiite Arabs, Baha'is, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jews, Christians. Manama, up to now, has in excess of 16 churches, and all the Christian sects have their churches. We have Persians, we have Indians, we have Europeans, we have Americans, we have people from the Persian coast, Africans. This is the community that lived or lives in Manama. So what made Manama able to have all this diversity of people? So the Banyan played a very important role in such diversity. So the book was translated into English, and many people from the Banyan read the book, their offspring, and and my book was written in the form of a novel. So, and the title is also similar to a famous title of a novel by a novelist who wrote a book about Alexandria. So when we talk about لا أحد ينام في المنامة, so Manama and Nom, which means nobody sleeps in a city whose name reflects the meaning of Nom, which is sleep. It's like nobody sleeps in the sleeping city or the city of sleep. So, of course, the Banyans have an association. So, this association is a Tatai Hindu community. So, this is a famous association or a society for the people living there, the Banyan. So they have a magazine entitled The Banyan, and they invited me and they asked and said that we want to meet you. And they said, we have read your book, and they said, we want a similar book about us. And I said, I'm not interested in your history, and I'm not thinking about history. I was thinking about something else altogether. I was interested in Ummah, or the nation, the Arab nation, and I was not interested in that particular group, a group of traders in a small area or city such as Manama or Muscat. And I said, neither do I have the interest in the topic nor the time to allocate to this particular topic. And they were very keen and intransigent, because if they want something, they would keep on asking for it until they get it. And I said, I apologize, I am not passionate about this particular subject. And time went by, and I finished with my book, لا اسم لها, a nation with no name, and I sent the book to the publisher. Time went by, and they invited me once again, and they said the same old story, and I said nothing has changed. And similar to many, I cannot write about anything if I do not have any passion for it. So And I said, this is not something that interests me as a topic. And they kept on saying, please, can you do that? And I tried to say this person would be perhaps writing a good book for you. And they said, no, no, all these names, we know them very well, but we would like to have a book about us similar to what you wrote when you wrote, لا أحد ينام في المنام, and nobody sleeps in al-manama. And I told them, give me a month. I'm going to study the matter, and I'm going to see if I can do it or not do it, and I will get back to you within a month. I went back to the archive, the British archive, and the different chronicles of the different travels and the local archive that I had, and I realized that the history of the GCC, in actual fact, was similar to a short kind of capsule that encapsulates the history of the Banyan. So this kind of journey from Siraf to Kish to Muscat to Manama, this in actual fact is the history of the GCC between the 10th and 20th centuries. These were the main kind of points that were interesting when it comes to the history of the GCC. That is why I became interested in this particular group and consequently wrote this book. So I'm going to stop here since Haidar wants me to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nader, for this valuable lecture and that enriching discussion. Certainly, this isn't the first time. Certainly, the first or the last time. For certainly, we will have shared scientific and other works, and this unit always seeks to build a network of cooperation with researchers in the Gulf region. And you are one of them, of course. And the discussion was also enriching. I have learned so much from this lecture. Thank you. And we have 2 hours have gone by. Thank you for attending. On Wednesday, we will continue our weekly seminar during the day at 12:30 p.m. and we will have also the seminar of the theorization of the Arab state. We will continue with other events. Peace and God's mercy be upon